I want to talk to you today about the doctrinal paradox. It's a close relative of Condorcet's paradox and also of the discursive dilemma. It was developed by Larry Sager and Louis Kornhauser. And the idea here is to think about the aggregation, again, of judgments, and note that individual rationality does not guarantee group rationality. In fact, we can come up with a rather odd situation in which people are making a decision. They decide on the various components and reach a decision about each one of them. And yet when they look at compounds, they find that their own judgments about the compounds aggregated do not match the aggregation of the outcome of the components. So once again, we get into a situation of each individual being entirely logical and consistent in their opinions. But we combine things into a group opinion and we find out that the group looks illogical. It looks irrational. So here is the example that Kornhauser and Sager come up with. It involves a three-judge panel evaluating a question of contract liability. And the problem is really to think about whether the person who is the defendant is liable. Now, there are two component questions to liability. So we have the question of interpretation of the contract first. Did the contract actually prohibit this kind of thing? And secondly, did you do it? If it was prohibited and you did it, well, then you're liable for breaking the contract. And so, simple enough question, but then we start looking at the three-judge panel and seeing what they say. Now, it turns out that Judge 1 thinks all of these things are true, says, yes, you're liable. Why? The contract did prohibit this kind of action, and moreover, you performed it. So you did something prohibited by the contract. You are in violation of the contract. Straightforward. Judge 2 looks at the same situation and says, I don't think you're liable. Why not? Well, I interpret the contract as forbidding this kind of behavior, but I don't think you in fact did that. And so, yes, this is ruled out by the contract, but you didn't really do that. And so, consequence is you're not liable for breaking the contract. Judge 3 looks at the same situation and agrees that you are not liable, but on a different basis. Says, look, I think you did it. You did seem to perform this action. However, as I interpret the contract, it is not actually forbidden. The contract doesn't really rule it out. So it looks as if the court decides in favor of the defendant. 2 out of 3 judges say there is no contract violation, there is no liability. But then when we look at the components, it's a little more complicated. Actually, 2 of the 3 judges agree that the contract does prohibit this sort of conduct. And so there is agreement 2-to-1 on the provisions of the contract and whether they rule this kind of thing out. And then we look at the question of, well, did the defendant actually do it? And 2 of the 3 judges say yes. So it looks as if we ask the judges to make a decision independently, we'd have 2-to-1 decision in favor of, yes, the contract prohibits this kind of behavior, and also a 2-to-1 decision in favor of the proposition that the defendant engaged in precisely that sort of conduct. And yet the court finds 2-to-1 that there is no liability, there is no contract violation. Now, that's somewhat bizarre if you think there actually was that sort of conduct being performed by the defendant, and if you think that the contract ruled it out, well, it looks like there should be, logically speaking, then a violation of the terms of the contract. But the way things go here, because the judges agree about the judgment that there is no liability, there is no violation, but for different reasons. One, because the contract so interpreted really doesn't rule this kind of thing out. And the second thing, because they don't think the defendant actually did it, then it turns out that although they agree about the ultimate judgment, that there is no violation, there is no liability, nevertheless, for different reasons, it means that there's actually a 2-to-1 panel majority favoring the proposition that the contract does prohibit this kind of behavior and that the defendant engaged in that kind of behavior. And logically speaking, it would seem to entail that then there is a contract violation and that the defendant is liable. Well, that's an example of the kind of irrationality that can emerge in this sort of group decision-making where we have a complex decision that depends on various component propositions. We might have general agreement about one of the propositions, general agreement about the other, and we combine them logically to say, so there must be general agreement that this is the conclusion, and not necessarily, because it might be that people diverge from that conclusion for different reasons. And the more possible reasons that are involved, the more components there are, the more likely this is to happen. So it's easy for us to look at judicial decisions or political decisions or group decisions of any kind and say, there's something incoherent about all of this. It's part of the reason that things designed by committee are notoriously bad. Because although each committee member may be entirely reasonable, entirely rational, have a well thought out position that's entirely coherent, you combine things in terms of the group and you start seeing utter incoherence and irrationality emerging. It can look like the result of the committee is something that doesn't make any logical sense. Well, Kornhauser and Sager tell us why. It's because of this possible combination of people diverging from a conclusion, but for different reasons. It might be that only a minority then end up supporting that conclusion, even though a majority actually support each component that would feed into that decision. Well, it's a surprising result, but on the other hand, having seen Condorcet's paradox and having seen the discursive dilemma, it's maybe a little less surprising. Still, it should make us worry about things designed by committee. It should make us worry about the rationality of groups, whether they're small groups like a panel of judges, or a large group like the United States Congress or like the population at large. People might largely agree about the various factors that enter into the decision and still end up reaching a different decision. Why? Because each diverges on something that's a component. And so even though large majorities support each of the component propositions, it turns out that only a minority support the logical combination of all of those views.